The development of children's memory skills. The multi-store model that we just described illustrates how a mature learner processes information. The memory processes and capabilities of children are, of course, not nearly as sophisticated. It takes them almost their entire school careers to become skilled and flexible information processors. To some degree, that process occurs spontaneously as children's brains develop. But the development of memory and related skills are also aided by particular kinds of classroom experiences. The following description is based on analyses of many years of memory research on children of various ages. By the middle school grades, the early middle school grades, most children have acquired some simple techniques on their own. They do, for example, rehearse, usually by naming items, organize objects and concepts into categories, link new information to what they already know, and recall pieces of information that are related in some way. They also show some ability to keep track of or monitor how well these memory techniques are working. Even better recall can be achieved if they are reminded to group things that go together as they try to learn them, and if those things remain visible during learning. Not only is this type of scaffolding effective when it is provided, but it has been shown to carry over to the following year. Children who are given these prompts are more likely to actively rehearse without being told than children who are not prompted. The spontaneous memory performance of middle school children is significantly better than that of primary grade children for several reasons. They know more about the meanings of various concepts and how they relate to other concepts, which is the basis of elaboration, and they have a better understanding of how their memory system works. But these skills do not develop in a gradual, consistent fashion in most children. Up to a certain point, which is different for different children, there is little evidence of a planful and independent approach to coding information, storing it in memory, and retrieving it later. But then it's as if they suddenly get it, because these behaviors start to appear without having been prompted. A relatively small percentage of children, perhaps 20%, develop more advanced memory skills more gradually. What causes this sudden shift from having to be prompted to use memory skills to using them more spontaneously? Research suggests at least two major factors: parent-child interactions and the intellectual demands of schooling. The ways in which parents talk to their children is thought to play a role in memory development. Children whose parents suggest such strategies as rehearsing information by repeating it either silently or out loud, or creating mental images, use those strategies more often and without prompting than do children whose mothers use who, what, where, when, and why statements and questions when talking about past and present events. Recall more of those events than do children whose mothers do not use those prompts. These types of conversations are thought to influence how children code, store, and retrieve information. Many of the school tasks children encounter on a daily basis involve memorizing, in other words, multiplication tables, songs, and the names of prominent individuals and the names of parts of speech, for example, and organizing, for example, animal and plant classification systems, themes in literature, and forms of government. Being forced to engage in these processes probably drives students to try different techniques and then draw conclusions about what works, what doesn't, and how things might be improved. Support for this hypothesis comes from a study that compared children who were just old enough to be admitted to first grade with children whose birthdays just missed that cutoff and spent the year in kindergarten. The average difference in age was 41 days. At the beginning of the school year, the two groups performed identically on a picture memory task. By the end of the year, the kindergarten students performed at the same level. Their kindergarten curriculum did not have a formal academic emphasis, but the first graders recalled significantly more pictures. The clincher is the performance of the kindergarten students the following year at the end of first grade. they performed similarly to last year's first graders. Just as parent-child talk is related to memory development, so is teacher-child talk. First graders whose teachers spent more time than other teachers talking about the relationships among ideas, asking students to remember what happened in previous lessons. In other words, what story did we read in class yesterday? What did the boy and the girl do in the story? And reminding students not to forget certain things were more likely than other first graders to use memory strategies themselves and to earn higher scores on memory tasks. This advantage was particularly noticeable among lower achieving students, but in a manner of speaking, there is a dark side to the research on teachers' memory talk. In addition to the kinds of reminders and prompts mentioned above, teachers could and should also provide direct instruction in how to improve students' memory and comprehension skills. For the most part, however, they don't. In the next chapter, we'll provide some disappointing statistics on the scarcity of strategy instruction in the typical classroom. Take a stand. Students are learners, not just performers. Visit a school in the last 2 months of winter, and you will see teachers preparing their students to perform as well as they possibly can on the state exams in April and May. Ask teachers why they are so focused on the state exams, and they will tell you that the administration has made student performance on the state exams a top priority. Ask the administrators why student performance on the state exams deserves so much time and energy, and they will tell you that poor student performance on the exams can decrease property values in the community, can mean the replacement at considerable expense of an entire curriculum, can even cost teachers and administrators their jobs. As you will see in Chapter 15, Understanding Standardized Assessment, a lot is riding on students' performance on the state exams. And so teachers guide students through the material they expect to be on the tests. Teachers go over and over it in an effort to ensure that every student gets every possible test item correct. The teachers lead these students through seemingly endless drill and practice. Some teachers and some students call it drill and kill. The teachers work very hard, the students work very hard, and the administrators feel the pressure and keep the pressure on. Days and weeks of drill and practice focused on rote learning that serves only to make students perform better on a test go against what research tells us about effective learning. By focusing on discrete information or skills, students have few opportunities to draw on their prior knowledge, to learn in authentic settings, to explore and investigate so as to understand new information in meaningful contexts. Research shows us that prior knowledge is critical for student learning. Drilling students to perform can kill learning. We believe educational professionals must be held accountable, but they should be held accountable for student learning, not just test performance. If we are content simply to focus on performance, then let's continue to devote each winter to test preparation. But if we value our students as learners instead of performers, then the time has come to end the winter of our discontent. And we should do it now. Someone needs to drill and kill the person who said that. Does the author's position accord with your own experience? That is, did you feel as you were learning material solely for the purpose of answering questions correctly on a state-mandated test and not for any future meaningful use? If so, how can you prepare your students for these examples and still make the learning experience relevant to their lives? I think you can do both. Suggestions for teaching. Helping your students become efficient information processors. Develop and use a variety of techniques to attract and hold attention, and give your students opportunities to practice and refine their skills in maintaining attention. Be aware of what will capture your students' attention. The ability to capture your students' attention is affected by characteristics of the information itself and the learner's related past experiences. Learners are more likely to attend to things they expect to find interesting or meaningful. It is also true that human beings are sensitive to abrupt, sudden changes in their environment. Thus, anything that stands out, breaks a rhythm, or is unpredictable is almost certain to command a student's attention. Print keywords or ideas in extra large letters on the board. Use colored chalk to emphasize important points written on the board. When you come to a particularly important part of a lesson, say, "Now really concentrate on this. It's especially important." Then present the idea with intensity and emphasis. Start off a lesson with unexpected remarks such as, "Imagine that you have just inherited $1 million and my pants are on fire." To maintain attention, emphasize the possible utility of learning new ideas. Although it is possible to overdo attempts at making the curriculum relevant, it never hurts to think of possible ways of relating school learning to the present and future lives of students. When students realize that the basic purpose of school is to help them adapt to their environment, they are more likely to pay close attention to what you are trying to do. Or be sarcastic. Example, teach basic skills such as arithmetic computation, arithmetic reasoning, spelling, writing, and reading as part of class projects that relate to students' natural interests. For example, keeping records of money for newspaper deliveries, measuring rainfall, temperature, and wind speed, writing letters to local television stations to express opinions on or request information about television shows. Teach students how to increase their span of attention. Remember that paying attention is a skill that many students have not had an opportunity to refine. Give your students plenty of opportunities to practice and improve their ability to maintain attention. Examples: institute games that depend on maintaining attention, such as playing Simon Says, keeping track of an object hidden under one of several boxes, the old shell game, or determining whether two pictures are identical or different. At first, positively reinforce students for all correct responses. Then reinforce only for improvements in performance. Remind students that their success is a direct result of how well they pay attention. Read a short magazine or newspaper story and ask students to report who, what, where, when, and why. Point out and encourage students to recognize that certain bits of information are important and can be related to what they already know. Attention is one control process for the sensory registered. The other is recognition. Sometimes the two processes can be used together to induce students to focus on important parts of material to be learned. Sometimes you can urge your students to recognize key features or familiar relationships on their own. Examples: the math problem is very similar to one you solved last week. Does anyone recognize something familiar about this problem? In this chapter, the same basic point is made in several different ways. As you read, try to recognize and write down as many variations on that basic theme as you can. Give students opportunities to express ideas in their own words and relate new knowledge to previous learning. Have students practice grouping numbers, letters, or classroom items according to some shared feature, such as odd numbers, multiples of 5, letters with circles, or things made of wood. Show students that they can become more efficient learners by combining previously unrelated facts and concepts into large or larger chunks. Do you recall our discussion of short-term memory being limited to about 5 to 9 items or chunks of information at any point in time? If you don't, perhaps you should take that as a cue to pay particularly close attention to the contents of this chapter. We also said that this limit could be fudged somewhat by taking advantage of the principle of chunking. Basically, this involves creating associations between what you're trying to learn and information you have in long-term memory. In this way, you can take what may have been 4 or 5 separate pieces of information and reduce them to one piece. The power of chunking information into meaningful units was dramatically demonstrated in a study conducted with a single college student of average memory ability and intelligence. Over 20 months, he was able to improve his memory for digits from 7 to almost 80. Being a track and field buff, he categorized 3- and 4-digit groups as running times for imaginary races. Thus 3,492 became 3 minutes 49.2 seconds, near the world record time. The number of groups that could not be encoded as running times were encoded as ages. These two chunking techniques accounted for almost 90% of his associations. Part of the reason why chunking works is that it reduces the load on memory. By combining previously unrelated bits of information into larger units, we actually have less to learn. The other part of the reason is that it creates more coherent and meaningful units, which are easier to recall. If at all possible, try to include lessons on and opportunities for students to practice chunking. Take advantage of the power of distributed practice. If you knew you were going to be tested over the contents of this chapter a few days from now, would you wait until the day before the test, before reading the entire chapter a few times? Or would you read about 1/3 of the chapter with a quick review several hours later of what you had read earlier for each of 3 days before the exam? If you opted for the first approach, you would be engaging in what psychologists call massed practice, or cramming. If you chose the second approach, you would be engaging in distributive practice. Will your choice make any difference in your test score? It almost certainly will. The superiority of distributed over massed practice for a wide range of materials and learners is well established in the research literature. Now turn this example around and picture yourself as a primary grade teacher who is writing out a lesson plan to teach the beginning reading skill of grammar, phoneme, letter sound correspondences for 30 minutes each day for the coming week. Your students will perform better on a subsequent test if you divide your lessons into 3 10-minute sessions a day rather than 1 30-minute session. Distributed practice works for the same reason that chunking works. It reduces the demand on memory. If your students are intellectually ready to direct their own learning, you should tell them about the relative merits of distributed versus massed practice. Most students not only are unaware of the benefits of distributed study periods, but also go to considerable lengths to block or mask the study time devoted to a particular subject, even when that tactic is a hindrance rather than a help. Organize what you ask your students to learn, and urge older students to organize material on their own. At least some items in most sets of information will ask your students to learn, will be related to other items, and you will find it desirable to call attention to interrelationships. The Bauer et al. Experiment described earlier, in which one group of students was given a randomly assigned arranged set of items to learn, and another group was presented the same items in logically ordered groups, illustrates the value of organization. By placing related items in groups, you reduce the number of chunks to be learned, and also make it possible for students to benefit from cues supplied by the interrelationships between ideas in any given set, or between items in any given set. And by placing items in logical orders, you help students grasp how information at the beginning of a chapter or lesson makes it easier to learn information that is presented later. If students are to learn how to identify trees, birds, rocks, or the equivalent, group items that are related, for example, deciduous trees and evergreen trees. Call attention to distinctive features and organization schemes that have been developed. Print an outline of a chapter on the board, or give students a duplicated outline and have them record notes under the various headings. Whenever you give a lecture or demonstration, print an outline on the board. Call attention to the sequence of topics and demonstrate how various points emerge from or are related to other points. Make what students learn more meaningful by presenting information in concrete visual terms. To avoid blank stares and puzzled expressions from students when you explain an idea in abstract terms, try using representations that can more easily be visualized. Concrete analogies, for example, offer one effective way to add meaning to material. Consider someone who has no knowledge of basic physics but is trying to understand a passage about the flow of electricity through metal. For this person, statements about crystalline lattice arrays, free-floating electrons, and the effects of impurities will mean very little. However, such abstract ideas can be explained in more familiar terms. You might compare the molecular structure of a metal bar to a Tinker Toy arrangement, for example, or liken the effect of impurities to placing a book in the middle of a row of falling dominoes. Such analogies increase recall and comprehension. You should also consider using what are called graphical displays. These are visual, symbolic, spatial representations of objects, concepts, and their relationships. Examples of graphical displays include diagrams, matrices, graphs, concept maps, and charts. According to Alan Pavio's dual coding theory discussed earlier, the use of graphical displays leads to higher levels of learning because the displays increase the concreteness of information, thereby allowing the information to be encoded in memory in both a visual and a language format. Evidence from both cognitive and neuroscience research supports the idea that information can be stored in long-term memory in both visual and linguistic forms. Another theory, called the visual argument hypothesis, holds that graphical representations aid learning because the spatial arrangement of the ideas that make up the display allows for a visual form of chunking, thereby decreasing the demands on working memory. Support for the visual argument hypothesis comes from research that shows that students who are given graphic organizers are better able to integrate information and draw inferences about relationships than are students who are given plain texts. Examples: when you explain or express complex and abstract ideas in several ways, be sure to provide plenty of examples. Use illustrations, diagrams, and concept maps. Make sure the type of visual display used is consistent with the goal of a lesson. For example, when the goal is to understand a cause and effect relationship, diagrams that show relationships among objects or concepts should be used. But when the goal is to learn about changes over time, as in plant or animal growth, animation would be a better choice than a static display.